All right. Well, welcome to the future. Stepping into the future, we're going to be talking about the future of consciousness. And I mean, essentially, I think a lot of people think of consciousness almost kind of as a footnote, right? It's kind of a like, yes, the evolutionary timelines in the universe. There's these self-replicating patterns that are really good at making copies of themselves. And yes, some of them have consciousness, and that's interesting and whatnot. But no. Here I'm actually going to tell you that consciousness will play a key, pivotal, causal role in the actual evolution of the cosmos. And I think like we're starting to see the broad outlines of that, how that could actually happen. So I'm gonna share the presentation. Is my presentation? Oh, fantastic. Okay. So yes, the full title of the talk is The Future of Consciousness, Preventing Suffering and Engineering Paradise as an Optimization Problem. Of course, stepping into the future. And I wanted, to thank Adam. And also, I feel very grateful to be in the same panel/block with David Pierce and Mike Johnson, two of, essentially the philosophers who have influenced me the most in quite deep ways about how I think about the universe, the world, and consciousness in particular. Okay, so right off the bat, I said this is going to be an optimization problem. So assume that you want to eliminate suffering or minimize suffering as much as you can, and that you're interested in engineering paradise. Okay, so how will you do that? So I think there is a critical piece of information that is usually not taken into account in kind of utopian visions, which I will actually be defending from a theoretical and empirical point of view, but for now, just take it for granted. I'll revisit it, which is this idea that pleasure and pain scales are actually logarithmic compressions of something that is actually an exponential phenomenon, meaning that extreme bliss, extreme pleasure is actually orders of magnitude more intense and delightful than, it's really conceivable within our standard frame of mind, and likewise for suffering. And I think if you don't have this in your model, then any kind of optimization for well-being will just be, optimizing the wrong thing. Now, there's an additional critical piece of information here, which is productivity, which actually makes the optimization problem non-trivial and really interesting. So, okay, this is obviously very schematically. I don't think this is exactly, the case, but to a first approximation, kind of like human productivity and motivation and desire to actually, work towards your own values and so on, peaks, somewhere in the positive valence range. You feel good, you feel motivated, but you're not, just so ecstatic and blissed out that you just, you can't move, you're in your bed, kind of like having a transcendental experience or something like that. That's probably not conducive to, filing the report, the quarterly report for your company or something like that. So there's, kind of like an optimal zone of productivity. Okay, so if you look at these, three curves, hopefully something stands out. And what I'm referring to is there are three big deltas. I kind of like want to make fun of these because there's a comic and a book about how to sound smart, and like a person who has normal intelligence would say something like, okay, but what is the difference here? But a smart individual would say, what is the delta? And in this slide, there's actually three deltas. So you can tell this is a very, very smart presentation. So essentially there's three big deltas. Essentially there's three areas, three regions in kind of the hedonic scale where you will get outsized returns by just kind of like increasing the hedonic range a little bit, at least insofar as it comes to the scales. So if you care about kind of optimizing well-being, minimizing suffering, I would suggest that these three regions are actually really relevant. And actually, they are kind of the basis of the strategy that I am proposing for how to kind of interface with the future of consciousness, which is to break it down into three sub-problems. So first of all, we've got to eliminate negative extremes, essentially kind of have strategies and tools and policy that essentially really puts a kind of a priority on going from the extreme pain to, okay, like the not so extreme pain. Now, of course, just doing that will not necessarily enhance productivity, because if you're at a -5, in the hedonic range, you're probably still not going to be very productive, right? So, but from an ethical kind of like absolute value point of view, this is really, really critical, obviously. Then you also need what I call increased baseline, ways to kind of like go from, okay, almost neutral states of consciousness to, those that are actually motivated and able to work towards these values. And finally, yes, achieve new heights, which is, kind of how I'm proposing this idea that, actually like looking at the extreme positive range is probably a key source of value that it's very important to not ignore. Now, I actually think that it's not just the case that these three regions are kind of like, a very big bang for your buck. I think they're synergistic. And I think this is really critical, that if we kind of like decide to use this as a frame, it actually reinforces itself as a whole. I mean, I want you to think of this as kind of a gestalt, not just sub-problems that are independent of each other, but actually sub-problems that if you're able to solve them, they feed on each other. And here's just kind of like a cursory, very schematical. I mean, obviously, to do this properly would actually be, like rigorous computational social science and seeing, how different hedonic ranges influences behavior and social, social action and so on. But okay, very schematically, we have that preventing negative extremes. Okay, very directly, a very direct effect is large reduction in suffering, but it has these like additional, downstream effects, such as like aligned motivation, that like, because what bad suffering is like, you actually are motivated to get rid of it. Also, this very maybe esoteric concept, but kind of like merit generating merit. Okay, like from these, Eastern philosophies, I'm not saying that there's like literally, some kind of karma that you're generating outside of your brain or anything like that. But no, I mean, like socially, there is some kind of like social reality, that is important to interface with, which is that, hey, if you're somebody who actually helped people escape hell, experiential hell, you are going to get social merit. And this is really important. This is an important resource within this feedback loop. And of course, yes, a lot of extremely thankful people, even now, like we haven't kind of like instantiated the full on project, but I get messages like fairly routinely of people who had, things like kidney stones and cluster headaches, and thanks to my writings, now they actually don't have these conditions. So I'm going to return back to that. But, that's a tremendous source of aligned motivation, like really thankful people reaching out and possibly kind of like building up a coalition. Increased baseline also gives you increased productivity and obviously an enjoyable everyday life, which also generates aligned motivations and skin in the game, because if you are actually enjoying your day to day, there's a reason for you to, fight for life, fight for the continuing existence in a sense, because it's actually, worth what they're experiencing. And finally, achieving new heights. Yes, it has this very direct, large increase in bliss, but it also generates valence realism, this understanding that, yes, actually, the thing that matters within experience is valence. And this becomes really obvious when you explore the extremes. It's not easy to kind of like figure that out when you're like in the normal hedonic range. When you look at the extremes, this is like self-evident. So having safe and reliable access to ultra blissful experiences, will make people very, very open to valence realism. That there is actually such a thing as an objective measure of how good the experience feels. These together actually, at least empirically, seems to also, gives rise to people opening up about ideas like open individualism, this idea that we are all one consciousness. That tends to be very consonant with peak experiences, especially ego-transcending peak experiences, as I'm going to be discussing in a few minutes. And this, also enhances care towards all sentient beings. All of these things together essentially reinforce what I would call valence-aware value alignment, which feed back into caring about preventing negative extremes, increasing baselines, and achieving new heights. So I'm making the claim that, focusing on this project within these three subcomponents, they're synergistic. It's a gestalt project. It's not just a disparate set of things going around. They help each other out. So how I construct this, there's two absolutely key insights that you need if you want to kind of minimize suffering, paradise engineering. So first of all is, the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain. And the other is the causal effects of valence. That valence is not epiphenomenal. It actually has, causal computational implications, how good or bad you feel. And I'll, essentially like steal Mandy's versions, but, just the bullet point version is that, I would claim that it's likely that the bulk of current suffering is actually concentrated in a tiny percentage of experiences, simply because of how extreme these scales are. And the same is the depth when it comes to the depths of bliss. The level of ecstasy and feelings of well-being possible are unimaginably huge. I think this is just an empirical fact. Like, it's literally unimaginable. Like, if you come out of one of these states after 10 minutes, you realize, I actually can't imagine it. It's just not within our our ability to actually imagine how blissful things can be. But they can be. It's an empirical fact. When it comes to causal effects, there's a very important correlation between productivity and hedonic tone. Again, this is not a linear thing. There's kind of this bump in productivity. There's also, pleasure pain axis also, it sounds very philosophical term, but has a reflective disposition, meaning that intelligent organisms that are driven by a valence axis essentially tend to orient their behavior around it. So that itself is saying, okay, like this is a causally significant thing. And third, value element can be grounded in open individualism and valence realism. That because you have kind of this direct access to the actual hedonic range of consciousness, you understand what matters in reality. And especially, with some philosophical sophistication, you realize that, you wanting to be happy is exactly the same thing. From a certain point of view as anybody else wanting to be happy. So there's kind of this realizing that the universe doesn't have a center. Every point in space-time is equally real and therefore equally valuable or important to take care of. So why logarithmic? Why long tails? If you're really curious about these, I would recommend reading this article. The shorthand is log scales, but you can find it in the qualiaresearchinstitute.org website. And also in the EA forum, if you type in, logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain. To a first approximation, I'll just give you like the bullet point ideas for why this is the case. If you actually want to dive into the core arguments, the empirical data, the analysis, it's all in the article. I'm not gonna dive deep into that because it's a 5-hour presentation all of its own, obviously. But the first approximation we have, the extremes of valence as described by people who actually experience them routinely do have this, self-reported quality of phase transitions, where essentially when you have a transition from one phase to another, oftentimes there's a change in the order of magnitude of the intensity. This is something that I actually remember quite vividly when I had a case of hot pepper hands, accidentally burned my hands. I would flip between 4 out of 10 to 5 out of 10 pain. And there was something about that transition that actually had an objectivity to it. Essentially, the kind of pinch points synchronizing, and all of a sudden you have this larger resonant pad of pain, and it's like qualitatively worse. So likewise for well-being, the various jhanas, which are these extremely concentrated states of consciousness, they have like phase transitions. People describe some versions of them as like different to baseline in terms of an order of magnitude of intensity. It's a really substantial difference. And 5-MeO DMT people, I know people who've taken a lot of 5-MeO DMT and very, very rational, very smart. They straight up say that, the peak of a 5-MeO DMT trip can be 100 times more consciousness per second than normal everyday life. This is an extreme effect. Essentially the explicit way in which pain scales have been described by their creators. You have the KEEP pain scale, which is for cluster headaches and other disorders like that. They explicitly say, 10 out of 10 in this scale is not just a little worse than 5 out of 10, is actually 10 times. Like, it's a logarithmic scale by design. Because otherwise, you can't actually describe the upper ranges if you don't make it logarithmic. Then you also have the Schmid-Sting pain index, which is essentially a breakdown of the pain of different stings by the Hymenoptera class, I think, in biology, which is like the wasps, insects. And yeah, I mean, essentially it goes from 1 to 4, and each increment is 10 times more intense than the previous one. And this is something that, it can be tested reliably. You can, literally use like 10 bees in one arm and then one harvester ant in the other arm. And you can tell, yeah, this is roughly the same intensity. So, and yeah, a bee sting, is a 2 out of 4, and a harvester ant is a 3 out of 4. Yeah, so essentially, yeah, there's some logarithmic quality here. But then there's also like neurological correlates. Like if you actually look at in vitro activity of neurons, where they're actually measuring the activity of every neuron in a network, and you plot kind of like how many they get activated per second, this follows what's called a log normal distribution. Essentially, is the same. It's kind of very similar to the signature of cascades or avalanches, where you have like a few very large avalanches that account for, in some sense, yeah, the bulk of the activity. And then you have this very, very long range of small avalanches that account for the rest. And this is, I think, like best understood as kind of like differences in a neurological weather, as it were. So that, somebody who suffers a lot is kind of like the Swiss Alps of suffering. There's like a lot of things going on that are making like cascades of pain much more likely and much larger than for other people, which, yeah, explains, these are like multiplicative factors. It's not a linear relationship here. The extreme case would be this phenomenon. It's called explosive synchronization for people with fibromyalgia. That essentially, yeah, if you actually read out, neural activity in their body, there's this thing, explosive synchronization. Essentially, you have these huge cascades of activity that get triggered by very, very little stimuli. All of that is, yeah, very compatible with kind of a logarithmic or long tails of pleasure and pain. Then we have like psychophysics. I mean, essentially Weber's law essentially says that, there are just noticeable differences in perception, such as like brightness of colors or the weight of things. Essentially, you can only tell a difference in proportion and not a difference in absolute value. And there's an interpretation of these where actually the thing that is different is the intensity of the qualia. And I think there's a lot more things that are consistent with this interpretation than with the other interpretation, which is that there's a logarithmic compression in the senses themselves, so that by the time it becomes an experience, is actually linearized. This might be a little bit technical, but I think this is a very important and solid point, that actually the differences in proportions are applied to differences in intensity of qualia, not only differences in intensity of stimuli. And finally, yeah, we did a pilot research study where essentially, yeah, we asked people to rate, rank, and compare their top 3 best and worst experiences in their life in terms of pleasure and pain. And we did a lot of, data science on that. And every angle that we took to kind of analyze this data was consistent with logarithmic scales, and it was inconsistent with linear scales. So to me, on a personal basis, I'm pretty sold that like logarithmic scales is correct. The thing that we don't know exactly is what is the base. Is it a logarithmic of 2 or is it a logarithm of 5? My current, best estimate would be something like 4.5. I'm not going to get into like how I arrived at that number, but yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, from 1 to 10, it can go really high because it's, 4.5 to the, whatever number in the scale is. This is the visualization that kind of came out of that research. So essentially we're comparing kind of the intuitive linear magnitude of intensity of experiences, where essentially you have kind of like patches of positive hedonic tone or negative hedonic tone. I to some extent, I apologize for showing these pictures because it might be traumatizing for some people to, think about this, but, we're very seriously trying to figure out the future of consciousness. This is obviously a very key, piece of the puzzle. And essentially, yeah, you have this relationship that the amount of energized qualia in your world simulation, as you increase in valence, essentially, yeah, kind of like explodes. I mean, it's not just like, yeah, you have like, 50% more. We're talking about you have like 100 times more. I mean, if you take like 5-MeO DMT and have a breakthrough experience, yeah, you kind of feel like that huge, galaxy-sized crystal consciousness stuff is this very weird, exotic thing. It's not like within the normal human range of experience. And the same for the negative stuff. I mean, like something like cluster headaches, they're not just kind of a very intense headache. They're it's a beast from a different dimension, really. I mean, we're talking about, some kind of Lovecraftian type stuff that is horrific beyond human imagination. Okay, so taking this into account, the boundary conditions for the optimization problem, what are they? So first of all, in the human form, productivity peaks in the positive hedonic range. As we talked about, I think that's a very important piece of information. It's actually very difficult to kind of like have very intelligent, rational agency in a state of, anxiety and misery. Like it usually doesn't work that way. Actually, like if you want to be firing in all cylinders, kind of like being in the in the Goldilocks zone of positive valence is actually the way to go. Second is the negative experiences can be dramatically reduced without being reflected in effective productivity, which is why just focusing on negative extremes doesn't really work as kind of an optimization problem, although it is a key piece of the puzzle to maintain value alignment. Third is extremes of positive valence are orders of magnitude more packed with well-being qualia than imagined. General intelligence, animated by gradients of valence, can have somewhat orthogonal values to valence, and actually this is very tricky. I mean, I think me and David and even Mike, I believe like we don't fully buy into the orthogonality thesis, which is this claim that intelligence and benevolence are fully dissociated, but they're like partially dissociated. Why? Because you could still have like a fairly conscious intelligence that, for example, fails at some basic philosophy. Like, for example, if it's a direct realist, it could be really smart. It could have a lot of causal power, but still actually not be benevolent, right? So just being very intelligent doesn't guarantee benevolence. But I do think that there is a threshold of kind of philosophical intelligence with empirical, expanded experiential base that does, converge on benevolence, especially when it involves, something like open individualism and valence realism. Finally, these two minor points, high levels of quote unquote integration, which I'm not going to delve too deep into, increases the correlation between explicit values and alignment with valence. I mean, essentially more integrated world simulations that are more consistent across more layers, essentially, it's harder for them to deceive themselves. And to that extent, its values tend to be more aligned with each other and with valence. And finally, I think there are some high valence experiences that are what I call team consciousness compatible. 1 second. Okay. And actually, all of this adds up to something that is not that different from some, Eastern conceptions of heaven and hell. Without the metaphysics, right? But like the critical, isomorphism here is that, the Jains and the Buddhists will say that, both hell and heaven are far, greater and more numerous than it's imaginable for a human. That is true when it comes to realms of consciousness. But also they emphasize that, a human birth is actually a very lucky thing, because when you're, in the human state, you actually have kind of like maximal lucidity. You have the ability to actually have the largest causal effects because you're not engrossed by pleasure or just running away from suffering. So you should definitely also, we should definitely value a lot kind of this optimal hedonic range. Even if it's not super extreme, it's still very important for any kind of optimization of paradise. Okay, so why care about negative extremes? I get that a lot sometimes. Like some people kind of like have this belief that like, okay, if we only focus on kind of increasing baseline, that's all we need, because then we can create a society that is like that. Well, the deep esoteric reason why it doesn't work that way is because if you don't, put some resources on eliminating suffering directly, there's actually the risk of value drift. That the thing that you end up doing exclusively is just figuring out how to replicate more effectively, more efficiently, essentially becoming what I call a pure replicator. So actually, I think like I very much trust people who actually do spend some time of their day volunteering or helping out or trying to reduce suffering, and I think that it maintains some level of value alignment that is really critical. But then also like more object level concerns. the lens is novel. I mean, this idea of like actually quantifying valence and saying like, hey, this disorder actually has orders of magnitude more suffering. This is a new lens. It has a few years to being around in the water supply. It hasn't even been picked up by effective altruism yet. We're early stages. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit, you guys. Like, there's like a ton of low-hanging fruit. I encounter fascinating, promising projects all the time. And I mean, essentially, I think like we could easily, put in like 1,000 high-quality researchers on this task and continue to make progress. This is not like AI safety where you put like, 1,000 researchers and like maybe one of them has a clever idea and like moves the field forward. No. Here you can actually make good progress on a day-to-day basis if you're smart and driven and ethical. So again, a lot of low-hanging fruit, you guys. There's a lot of opportunities here. Second one is, this is unpleasant to think about, right? So that actually means there's an ethical arbitrage opportunity. And like, I see this all the time. I talk about intense suffering with people. They might nod along and say like, yeah, that's important. But then it seems like they forget about it. It's like, it didn't actually kind of like influence, because it's unpleasant to think about. Okay. So if you are somebody who can actually think about this and reason about this, like, it's almost kind of with great power comes great responsibility. Like there's like a huge, vault of possible value here, and people are not picking it up because, it's just not a good topic for, a dinner conversation or something like that. Then, okay, if you're, very Darwinian kind of like, I want, glory and I want high status or something like that. There's also that opportunity here. I mean, essentially, it's only a matter of time before this becomes visible and legible. And gratitude / glory and joy is given to those who notice this and began work on it before it was cool. So you guys and, other people who read this, read the blog and QRI, like, this is like even before early adopters, right? Like this is kind of like getting a peek sneak into how, frameworks of consciousness will work in the future. This is kind of like you're seeing into how people will think about this in a few decades from now. If you work on these projects yourself now, you will get a lot of glory. You will be, maybe even put in the history books as, yes, this person enabled the eradication of cluster headaches. Yes, there's glory to be obtained here. Even though, aesthetically, I may not be in favor of that framework. If it helps, let's make that happen. Okay, so I also think it's possibly, or actually quite likely, the most direct good that you can do in the margin within 5 to 15 years. It's also a source of value alignment, as I said, like field of merit. I mean, I trust more people who actually volunteer and, spend some time and resources, like caring about the well-being of others and so on. There's like synergy when you have like critical mass of people like that. And, to David's credit, he has this fascinating critique / commentary on long-termism. I have the link in the slide. Essentially, that which is eradicated today has a much greater chance of staying eradicated in the long term. So if we can get rid of these now, chances are the future will not have it either. So that's also why it's so critical to work on it. I wouldn't be able. So again, as I was describing, like if we only focus on increasing baseline, our descendants may actually not even care about non-human animals. It's not a given that factory farms will be closed. That actually depends on people with the right values, getting the right positions of power. As cynical as that sounds, it's true. Okay, so let's get into the weeds here. So part 1, when it comes to eliminate negative extremes, my claim is that the future of consciousness is anodyne. And anodyne is, a word I only recently learned from reading, essentially general-anesthesia.com, an essay by David Pierce about the history of anesthesia. Was marketed as anodyne because anodyne means inoffensive, especially, on purpose, things that are like actually don't, just fully devoid of kind of like a negative quality. and here's like some fascinating facts, right? Like, so, doctors actually used ether at parties for many decades before anyone suggested using it for anesthesia, which is kind of mind-blowing, but that's what the history says. Humphrey Davy was the first to suggest nitrous oxide for surgery. And then Michael Faraday, who was a student of him, like, yes, Michael Faraday of the electromagnetic field equations fame, he suggested nitrous oxide for surgery in 1820 or something like that. You know, he published that actually, but people didn't listen. They didn't, you know, that there was no follow through on that. So it actually took failed and then successful public demonstrations in, 1846 or so, for the medical community to say like, holy cow, this actually works. You can actually conduct surgery on ether and the person will not experience any pain. This actually works, you guys. So here's, a bit of kind of like the timeline, and it's just mind-boggling, right? Like this tool was there for more than 50 years, 60 years. And even when it came out, there were still, religious and military moral objections against it. People were saying like, no, pain during surgery is necessary for healing or something like that. It took a while, but ultimately anesthesia was adopted. And thanks to that, now when you go on to get an operation, a procedure, you don't feel like you're being impaled or being cut open or, all of those extremely unpleasant things. You don't have to, thanks to anesthesia. So, is there anything today as significant for a reduction of suffering as anesthesia was in the context of surgery? Perhaps already known by a tiny minority? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. We have actually a ton of things that are as impactful as anesthesia was for surgery that are just not being picked up by people that could be applied today, let alone them as research leads for how to improve consciousness in the far future. So here's kind of a short list. Any one of these bullet points, I claim, very arrogant, but I think it's true, and that's why I'm actually very bold about this. Any one of these bullet points is hedonically as significant for the reduction of suffering as anesthesia was back in 1850. And I'll delve a little bit into some of them, but I'll just mention, we're doing kind of a project and, getting rid of, especially preventing kidney stones and gallbladder stones, which are actually like 42 out of 15 pain in the McGill pain index. Amputation of a finger is a 39 in the scale. And actually, we spend more time experiencing kidney stones as a civilization than we spend, experiencing operations. So in some sense, kidney stones is more suffering than what anesthesia is preventing already. Okay, so that's a huge opportunity there. A similar Fermi estimate suggests the same for cluster headaches, which can be eradicated with DMT and other tryptamines. Very importantly, anti-tolerance drugs. Essentially this paradigm that we are championing, where, essentially we realize that there are substances that you can combine together with other substances in order to prevent the tolerance to let's say, a painkiller or an anxiolytic. Okay, so, cluster headaches, that's a big problem. It's 1 in 1,000 people. But again, I've interviewed a lot of people with cluster headaches, migraines. Migraines are already really bad, right? Like people describe migraines as like 1,000 times more painful than, a tension headache, as they call it. Well, I interviewed somebody who experiences both migraines and cluster headaches. And he described it as, if the disruption caused by a migraine was sort of equivalent to a motorboat on the water, then a cluster headache is like a massive jet engine on the water. It's like 1,000 times more intense, more bright, more awful than a migraine. And then even within that, we conducted this pilot research asking people in support forums how many cluster headaches they experience per year. And this is what we got, which is also a long, follows a log normal distribution, meaning that, with this information, if you actually want to get rid of, suffering as much as possible in this lifetime, it really pays off to actually research where to aim your efforts so that, you actually are helping the people who are suffering the most. And this is obviously a non-trivial thing. DMT, this is a super, overpriced DMT vape pen. Obviously with subsidies, this would be like trivially cheap, like maybe $5. But even with these like ridiculously overpriced product, we're talking about, $2, $2.50 for preventing a cluster headache. I mean, something that, people say it's just far worse than death on so many dimensions. And it's like trivial easy. The technology already exists. This works for a very high percentage of people. I can't really tell you the precise number, but based on the interviews we have conducted, I would estimate something like 70 or 80% of people with cluster headaches would just have no cluster headaches if they had access to a DMT vape pen. You don't even need to hallucinate to actually abort a cluster headache. You can just take like small doses several times over 20 minutes or something like that, and that will do it. Again, ridiculously cheap, ridiculously cheap way of getting rid of a ring of hell, as it were. Now, there's also like benzodiazepine dependence. I think it's actually a very, very, very big problem. And I mean, just last year in the US, there were like 20 million prescriptions for benzodiazepines. And one thing is actually what the official guidelines are. And then another thing is how it's actually used in practice. And in practice, essentially you have that for most people, they develop tolerance and they're worse off for having started benzodiazepines. But the really awful thing, the thing that actually gets to the level of like logarithmic scales is benzo withdrawal, especially forced cold turkey benzo withdrawal. That is like essentially gets to 9 out of 10 suffering. It gets really, really bad. Hey, I think somebody has their mic. Michael, okay, fantastic, yes. There was this study in 1988 of number of panic attacks for people who were prescribed Xanax versus people who weren't. And you can see, the area under the curve is actually, favors placebo. Yes, in the moment it's actually going to help reduce the panic attacks. In the long term, it's actually just going to give you a lot more. And it's not just kind of like a mild rebound thing. The reason why, benzodiazepine withdrawal is so bad is twofold. First of all, it has a very disfavorable tolerance profile. Essentially, it's really, really good at down-regulating GABA A receptors. But then the second thing is it has such a broad spectrum of activity. It relaxes the lungs and the muscles, and even has apparently mitochondria activity. So essentially, benzodiazepines are prescribed for something like 20 different conditions, from insomnia to panic attacks to anxiety to muscle tension and so on. Well, if you're taking it for only one of those conditions and you stop, you're going to experience a rebound of all of the other 20 conditions as well, right? So actually the cost-benefit analysis really doesn't work for most people in most circumstances, especially as something you take every day. This is a big deal. We're talking about dozens of millions of people who are really screwed right now because of benzodiazepines. And it turns out there's already a solution to it, or something that looks a lot like a solution. Namely, in Italy, if you go to detox from high dose, benzodiazepine addiction, they will give you this drug that is called Flumaxonil. There's some technicalities to it, it's not orally bioavailable, so you actually need to either get an infusion or maybe a nasal spray or something like that, and medical supervision because you may have seizures. But in practice, it's actually a very safe procedure. And we're talking about a ridiculous improvement. Rather than the withdrawal lasting 9 months of horrific withdrawals, you feel you're having a panic attack 24/7, it's only 10 days. So, it's a massive, massive reduction. This also obviously it's not, it doesn't even have a patent, it's extremely cheap. And more so, what I find very, very promising is actually using it in microdoses for treating anxiety. So actually taking Flumaxonil rather than Xanax in order to treat anxiety. I suspect this, is probably going to be a mental health revolution if it works. I don't know if it works for anxiety, but I for sure know it works for benzodiazepine reversing tolerance. I've interviewed a bunch of people who've gone through the procedure, and their reports are really stunning. They still suffered in that withdrawal, but they say it's night and day relative to what they were actually going through naturally. Okay, so that's eliminate negative extremes. There's more kind of like in the portfolio of possible interventions, there's more things, but I'll move on to kind of like other aspects of the presentation, which is, essentially the future of consciousness also, has a higher baseline of hedonic tone. And this is actually really fascinating. So when people talk about like higher baseline, like, are we talking about like, just kind of like experiencing an amphetamine high all the time or something like that, or caffeine high all the time? Actually, not really, right? Like the sort of like vision that, within QRI, it's kind of like being cooked for what would it mean to have kind of a higher baseline, or interventions for higher baseline, has a lot to do with essentially understanding how meditation works in the long term. And this concept of Buddhist annealing, essentially judicious use of high energy states of consciousness in order to anneal self-organizing principles and forge a higher baseline in that way. Okay, I'm saying a lot of things. A lot of this, unfortunately, has an overlap, at least at the lexicon level, with a lot of woo kind of perspectives. But trust me, there's something very real here. So I used to be very, very skeptical, for example, of meditation on the 5 elements or something like that until I tried it. Now, I don't actually think that, you're merging with fire when you do fire meditation or something like that. No, there's something actually more fascinating that is going on. I think what is going on is that you're kindling / instantiating a self-organizing principle that behaves like fire in your nervous system. And if you do that judiciously, that actually can be very healing. It can kind of be purifying. Essentially, it's a high energy state of consciousness that can smooth out imperfections and pinch points and shear points and so on. Very, very, very helpful. I think like if we have a periodic table of self-organizing principles and how they combine, and we have a science of these, yes, actually, I think like, increase the baseline for everybody is within reach. I'm very optimistic about this. Now, I would say like, don't think of self-organizing principles as just kind of like colors or something like that. They're actually much more interesting than that, because when you talk about high energy configuration states of consciousness, there's like non-linearities that arise. I have a whole, there's a lot I've written about this, a lot of like, videos. I recommend watching a video I made called Nonlinear Wave Computing, where I discuss essentially, the role of non-linearities. But essentially when you are like kind of deep in meditation, in an energized state, the sort of things that you can kindle in your nervous system is more like, are you kindling a Charmander or a Pikachu, as opposed to are you kindling the color red or the color blue? Because they have special effects. They interact in non-trivial ways. It's not just different concentrations of a chemical. It's more like, how do you put together the pieces of a machine in order to create something interesting? And even how perception works, like how you render images like this. This shirt, very innocuous, but I would actually claim that when you look at this, it has a certain vibe. And the vibe actually comes from your visual system quickly trying to find a set of self-organizing principles that put together can render these, sense data very efficiently. So actually, when you look at a lot of pieces of art, you're not only looking at pixels, you're actually embodying self-organizing principles that are likely to generate these kind of shapes, which is why, art can be so mind-expanding and and trippy, is because you're embodying new self-organizing principles. Likewise, I'm a very big fan of exploring state spaces of consciousness. More recently, for the last few years, kind of exploring the space of possible scent experiences. And this is a non-trivial thing. Again, it's not just kind of like choosing a color from a palette. It's more like choosing like Pokemons to interact with one another. Like iris and lavender and vanilla have a non-trivial interaction between them that produces something that is more than the sum of the parts, in a very, very literal sense. So even perfumes, you should think of them as kind of exploring self-organizing principles. And there's a huge diversity of them. If you want to be kind of like, higher level of granularity, you can also think of, essential oils. The level that I like the most is actually pure molecules, because you have the more fine-grained control. Essentially, this combinatorial explosion here. It's not, this is why the state space of possible scents or experiences is not neatly captured by kind of a simple Euclidean space. No, because things interact. They have like nonlinear emergent effects. I guess like, yeah, I mean, if you kind of like do a combinatorial analysis of possible, molecules, possible drugs, yeah, there's like, 1 million, billion new undiscovered drugs, and not to speak of the possible, interactions between them. Essentially, yeah, the state space is huge. If you're worried about, boredom, being bored by a future with no suffering, fear not, because the combinatorial state space is enormous. You're not going to run out of things to explore. I guarantee you. Maybe, within normal human range of, energy levels and consciousness, maybe you can get bored of things to explore. When you step into kind of like slightly higher energy regimes, yeah, you can, essentially it's kind of like the chemistry of consciousness. There's just like so much to explore. You're not gonna run out of it. Okay, so who else has kind of this vibe, this, exploring the state space of consciousness and molecules, kind of like within the scope of increasing baseline? I'm obviously a huge fan of Alexander Shulgin. Last week, I actually had the privilege of being able to attend a Easter party at his place, or well, what used to be his place, hosted by Anne Shulgin, his wife. They wrote, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, which, I mean, essentially they document the subjective effects of, over 200 novel psychoactive substances, and all of them were actually synthesized in that lab. I mean, this also kind of like tells you a little bit about like just how extreme long tails of innovation are, right? Like you have like of 1 million people, maybe a handful of them discovered a new drug. And then you have Alexander Shulgin, who discovered, like 300 really worthwhile, completely novel psychoactives. It's going to be like that in general. Like innovation tends to follow also like a power law distribution or log normal distribution. I was very fortunate to be able to look into it. It's almost kind of a religious experience. Some people go to church. For me, going to the lab of Alexander Shulgin was like equally psychologically impactful, if not more. Here's a picture of a STP, serendipity, tranquility, and placidity. Although nobody knew what placidity was, so they, used peace instead. So this was kind of a euphemism for this drug called DOM, like a powerful amphetamine psychedelic. Anyway, that Shulgin invented and, escaped the lab, and a lot of people had bad trips with it. It's not a great drug, but it did have a great branding. Well, the thing I wanted to highlight about this is I looked at his shelf, actually. The main shelf at the center of the room is this one. And if you look into it, you will see, actually, he has a lot of aroma chemicals in there. And I can just imagine, like, Sasha Shulgin in the middle of, synthesizing the new phenethylamine or tryptamine of the day. He was taking whiffs of linalool and limonene and beta-pinene, which smells like pine. Yeah, I mean, like, clearly he was a fan of exploring the state space of consciousness more broadly, not only through drugs, but presumably through other methods like smell. So anyway, I highly recommend everybody should have a bottle of linalool as a reference qualia, so that, no matter where you are, we can all tune into the linalool, frequency of consciousness. Anyway, okay, I'm joking a little bit off track here, but I mean, this is kind of embodies the spirit of like increased baseline, exploring the state space of consciousness. There's no reason to get bored because there's like just so much to explore, and we haven't even looked into other continents. We've only explored nearby, really. I mean, all of these drugs and more are kind of Shulgin creations. I love this rendition. 8C is like a Facebook, it's like a Facebook page that does like very cute renditions with fish. This is a rendition of what it feels like to take specific drugs in phenethylamines I have known and loved. 2CE, kind of this. Well, anyway, you can look at this in your own time. It's like a very fun chart, but and obviously ridiculously simplified, right? Like, I mean, obviously, what it's like to take 2CB. There's so much more to it than just, that icon. But, the overall aesthetic of like, oh my gosh, there's kind of this periodic table of archetypal experiences and states of consciousness, and I haven't even begun classifying it. I mean, like, it's just so huge. It's just so huge and so diverse. And this takes us to, basically something I advocate for, which I call the rainbow God aesthetic, which is essentially the aesthetic of exploring the entire state space of consciousness. And let us not satisfy ourselves with exploring, underground grunge, or like post-rock or, classical music. No. Let's explore and understand it all. Let's actually map out the full range of possible experiences. That's the spirit. That is a sort of thing that is, obviously sustainable way of actually maintaining engagement, because there's so many discoveries to be had. I know that Adam Ford is very big on not only, happiness, but also novelty. And at least pragmatically, that's one way to actually, have kind of a reason to live. This is just a picture of the state space of scent. Obviously, it's much more complex than this. I think it's non-Euclidean, but, at a glance, this is a pretty good picture. As I was explaining, these are like really more like Pokemons. This is not just kind of like colors. No, the scents are these dynamic system experiences, and the same is going to be the case with complex experiences. When you think of like exotic states of consciousness to explore, don't think just of drugs. Think of, kind of like all of the possible kind of almost kind of Vajrayana avatars that you could possibly inhabit. Like rainbow god aesthetic. Okay, so now let's zoom out a little bit and like talk about what I call the energy/complexity landscape of consciousness. If I were to kind of like encapsulate exploring the state space of consciousness in just one image, it would be this, because, any state of consciousness has a valence component, how good or bad it feels. Any state of consciousness has an energy component, how much consciousness there is in that moment in time, how bright, how intense it is. And any state of consciousness also has a level of complexity or information content. If you're familiar with computer science or computer science metaphors, there's this idea of Kolmogorov complexity, which is what is the minimum description length for an experience. Now, of course, that assumes that you have kind of like a key for interpreting the description, which makes it not a universal measure, unfortunately. But I actually suspect there is a way of quantifying precisely the complexity of a state of consciousness in terms of something like number of symmetry breaking operations, something more native to actually how consciousness works. And the answer is you can go all the way from zero complexity, where everything is perfectly symmetrical. You're instantiating something like the point symmetry group, or something like that, like an extreme continuous symmetry, where absolutely any transformation you apply to it leaves it the same, all the way to like extremely high complexity, something like, pure white noise or Rachmaninoff, very, very complex experiences, or Rachmaninoff, while juggling, while solving a math problem. Okay, there's all of these elements put together. Yeah, that's kind of like a very complex experience. So I think like describing a state of consciousness in terms of, their energy level, their energy parameter, and their complexity, it goes a long way in telling you what kind of state of consciousness this is. And so, this is not only stamp collecting, but there's also kind of these like boundary conditions here, which actually starts to connect it to the third aspect of the future of consciousness, which is, I believe this, future of consciousness is not only engaging, it is ecstatic, where there will be safe and reliable access to ultra blissful experiences. Okay, so ultra blissful experiences are oftentimes actually, there's kind of like overlapping discussions of them together with mysticism. And in this paradigm, the QRI paradigm of how do you make sense of spirituality, actually, mystical states of consciousness are high energy, high valence configurations of consciousness. So like when you have kind of this feeling of divine rapture and connection with the divine or infinity, the beyond, that is usually a hypersymmetrical configuration that can hold a lot of energy without shaking itself apart. Essentially a really stable attractor of a hypersymmetrical, highly energized configuration. Now, this doesn't emerge naturally on its own. You have to either work towards it or take the right drug and the right set and setting. But essentially, the explanatory space with which I look at this problem is in terms of self-organizing principles together with valence structuralism. In other words, what are kind of like the various cellular automata rules? I mean, self-organizing principles are actually more general than cellular automata, but to a first approximation, what are cellular automata rules that give rise to like very symmetrical configurations that can capture a lot of energy? So I think like if you want to understand mystical states, that might be the right lens if you actually want to make progress and not, endlessly be stuck on talking about Shiva and Vishnu and the unmanifest and things like that. Yeah, it's not going to advance the understanding as much as actually talking about, valence structuralism, in what way the symmetries here correspond to the well-being. Now, I really actually like this diagram because it's easy to kind of like have like a quote unquote deep state of consciousness and say, wow, I know what happiness is, or I know what love is, while actually having only scratched the surface of what is possible. The archetypal, I would say, example of this is that, if you take LSD or something like that, in this diagram, you may easily enter, kind of this like I am, kind of like pure, like, oh, I'm witnessing type state of consciousness. And some people may say like, yeah, that's the pinnacle, that's the pinnacle of, subjective well-being and mysticism. That's just not the case. There's actually several more layers. And the one drug that actually does take you, quote unquote, all the way to kind of like full Buddhist awakening type experiences is 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, also called 5-MeO-DMT. And there really is a final phase transition between, what in this diagram is being shown as kind of like pure awareness or unmanifest self. A lot of people will confuse that with kind of like the peak experience, like the ultimate. But like, no. There's another layer. In here, they talk about it as the infinite or the absolute. Yeah, that is accessible with 5-MeO-DMT. And again, it's unimaginable. I mean, like it's a it's a Lovecraftian bizarre thing. It's not just pretty colors or something like that. Okay, so but my claim is that these are things that can be understood. And actually, Mike Johnson's Symmetry Theory of Valence and neural annealing are really important pieces of the puzzle here. That like when you're talking about kind of these very advanced, concentration states, high valence, blissful states, you're actually talking about compositions of hypersymmetrical configurations of your nervous system. And I actually think, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, and there's a lot that we can explore. Even just, trip reports keep coming out every day. Sometimes we post them on Quality Computing or QRI.org. About, essentially how, hey, it turns out, this 5-MeO-DMT state, or this like LSD state, or, jhana meditation happens to have this particular symmetry group, without which you don't actually get, the juice of the pleasure, of the happiness. So think of this as kind of, there's the building blocks, which are the various symmetries, and then there's the composition, then there's the emergent effect of the synergy between them and how they, collaborate together, similar to, like putting up a classical music and orchestra. All of the instruments themselves may have some, qualitative symmetries, but then you have the kind of like monster symmetry group that emerges when you put them together, and that can be, on a different tier, essentially. And, if you have this mindset, then actually a very natural question is like, okay, so what is the perfect state of consciousness? David Pierce briefly talked about that in his presentation. Well, here's a crazy thing, that actually there's like many different base level modes of organizing attention and awareness that give rise to different possible peaks. Now, the classical kind of peak experience that most people are familiar with, if they've taken something like LSD or meditated a lot, is going to be kind of this centralized experience where everything kind of collapses into one point. So we can talk about this as kind of like the paradigm of centers. In what way can you make a center of your consciousness that is harmonized with everything else, that is really blissful? And there's like a ton of solutions, and I actually think there's like a ton of prime solutions, like things that like, if you change any one component of it, the whole thing falls down, because they actually like require all of the pieces of the puzzle together. And these are essentially what I describe as gems hidden in the state space of consciousness. I mean, essentially these amazing prime configurations that are like beautiful and lovely beyond the imaginable, that are actually require you to do a clever computational search in the vast combinatorial space to actually be able to find and then recruit and amplify and make sense of. But even this is, selling it short. This is selling it short. There's actually more to it than this. Why? Because, well, the kind of like center paradigm would be maybe, something like God mind is like, okay, everything becomes one and unified. There's a higher level of valence that is called no self. Also, they describe it as centerless consciousness, where actually things don't coalesce in a center that works as the kind of like pillar of the self-organizing principle that keeps information and the narrative together. Yeah, no, there's one that has no center. There is a family of states of consciousness, most of them extremely high valence, very, very free from suffering, that have no center, no experiential center. I know this sounds very, very bizarre. It also sounds like when people describe these, like maybe they're like lying or they're exaggerating. But I'm pretty convinced they're not. I mean, simply because some of them have also tried 5-MeO DMT, and they actually say things along the lines of like, yeah, no, actually, my day-to-day experience today is better than, a 5-MeO DMT peak. And it's equally centerless. So, Roger Teasdale, this like meditator, I wrote a blog post about him recently, called the supreme state of unconsciousness in quality computing, if you're curious. But yeah, he made this diagram of essentially kind of like the stages of modifying the self-organizing principle that constitutes attention and awareness as you progress on the quote-unquote spiritual path. Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, the first one, they have like thoughts and attention, and you have emotions, embodied emotions, and so on. That's kind of like a director in an orchestra, or like what Adam Ford is doing. It's kind of this central agency that is, kind of like selecting buttons and taking care of the state that way. But you're embodied and you identify with your sense of self. Then there's like this other state. Again, like each one of these states is something that a lot of people will confuse for the ultimate. But actually there's more, right? Like that's the crazy thing. Like the diversity of states of consciousness is unimaginable. But yeah, I mean, essentially, you go there and then you go to the witness, or you identify with the witness of consciousness. Then you identify with the entirety of your consciousness. They call it big mind or God consciousness. That would be kind of like, the centralized attention and awareness, self-organizing principle. Then you have essentially kind of this like no self experience. But then the final one is actually no self and no center. And that one is like very similar to 5-MeO DMT, but it's like sober. And it's like every day is a stable attractor. And yeah, people who experience that, they say like, yeah, this is just way better than like candy flipping or something like that. It might have taken them, 5 or 10,000 hours of like really rigorous meditation, but they did something to their brain that actually now they're like in this super enhanced state of well-being. Now, a lot of people, I would say most people, or everyone except maybe QRI, speaking very, very arrogantly here, will have explanations such as like, well, no self, no suffering. Like obviously, if you don't have a self, you're not going to suffer. Things like that. Like yeah, I don't think that kind of explanation really works out. What we use instead is valence structuralism. Essentially, we look at in what ways the geometric configuration of attention of awareness is different. And if that is more symmetrical, we predict essentially that is going to be higher valence. And yeah, by talking to Roger Teasdale, accomplished meditator, who experiences centerless consciousness every day, yeah, he says that essentially is a holographic kind of experience, that before he felt like he was kind of like a spider in a spider web, this epistemic agent that is like sensing things. But the problem with that is that essentially the spider web is wobbly, and the wobbles themselves are kind of disturbances and unpleasant. That's like, 99.99% of people experience the world that way. But his new baseline, he experiences kind of like this very tout greed, this very tout greed of awareness that has no center because it's the same everywhere. And it just senses on its own. It doesn't require to send information elsewhere. It's just kind of like the information is contained where it is. There's a lot of philosophical questions to hear, but the first approximation, we're talking about something that actually literally lost its center and is homogeneous in a geometric way. And we think that is why it feels good. I mean, essentially with that kind of configuration, you become extremely efficient at stress dissipation. Your stress dissipation capacity is much, much, much higher than baseline. Things don't bother you as much if you're in that configuration of consciousness. Okay, so getting back to kind of the state space, a couple more things. Well, all of this is to say, when it comes to achieving new heights, understanding peak, really intense, beautiful states of consciousness. Essentially, I think understanding fourth path, centerless states of consciousness is really critical. Within this map, they would correspond to things that are essentially to the complete left and up. So essentially high energy, hypersymmetrical states of consciousness. And just to kind of illustrate this concept a little bit more, there's this critical difference between this drug called DMT / the spirit molecule, as they describe it, and 5-MeO-DMT / the God molecule. So DMT tends to instantiate very intense experiences with very high level of complexity. So it's kind of in that neighborhood. I mean, it's not so much complexity that it's just pure noise, but it is enough complexity that what is going on in a DMT trip has many layers, right? You're in an ice cream shop and in a spaceship, and there's all these symmetry patterns and very complex interactions going on. 5-MeO-DMT is not like that at all. 5-MeO-DMT is, you become united with this, feeling of infinite consciousness with no boundaries and has close to zero information. And the valence that corresponds to these different states, very much matches the symmetry theory of valence. So the way we make sense of this in terms of self-organizing principles is that on DMT, essentially what your brain is doing is instantiating competing clusters of coherence. Essentially, there's this Darwinian process that gets instantiated where different regions of your experience become energized and kind of acquire a life of their own. The nonlinearities essentially stack on top of each other. And they compete in this crazy survival process. Whereas 5-MeO-DMT, and again, think of this as self-organizing principles. This is it's not just, 3D colors and patterns. These nonlinearities acquire a life of their own in a way. And they may be really good at specific things, computationally or hedonically, but it's going to be hyper specialized. I mean, it's kind of you're talking to a really fine-tuned machine that is really good at something in particular. You don't know what it is. But my guess is that, actually, quote-unquote DMT aliens or self-transforming machine elves are computationally non-trivial. It's just that we don't yet know what tasks they're actually really good at, which is kind of, you have this enormous computational substrate. You just don't know how to point it properly. But essentially, machine elves looking like these. Again, I don't think of them as literal entities outside of you. I think of them as embodied self-organizing principles with really novel computational emergent properties. Whereas 5-MeO-DMT, I call it the ultimate neural annealing drug. Essentially everything converges into one point, or space becomes completely homogeneous, or you transcend space and time. There's a lot of these things, but all of them essentially they have very small Kolmogger of complexity. And I think that's why ultimately they feel so good. Slash is so bad. Also you can have really bad trips on 5-MeO-DMT, which I think is essentially when you have two incompatible symmetries, as Mike would describe it on Principia Qualia, essentially both competing very tightly with each other. Okay, so that's getting to the end here. I'll just mention that, if things go right, and we actually kind of care about those three things, eliminate negative extremes, increase baseline, and achieve new heights of experience, what is kind of a good North Star? What would be a good kind of what do we find at the limit if things go well? Well, actually, I would claim there's really three kind of rough states of consciousness. Mike has an article called "What's Out There" in Open Theory. I also recommend Googling it. What's out there in Open Theory, where he talks about various possible uses of consciousness, such as technologized consciousness and things like that. What I'm presenting here is kind of a different, slicing of that, or a different cut, which is there's really kind of three core attractors that I think are probably really important. We're going to converge towards. One is hedonium, which is, physical matter and energy optimized for valence, or pure value is okay, this is what the universe wants in the most streamlined, direct way possible. Second, it would be qualia stream, essentially endlessly novel, exuberant, lovely, dynamic, intimate, expressive narrative stream that never fails to entertain and engage. And already with something like DMT, this is possible. Like, the problem with DMT is tends to be a mixed valence experience. But if you take MDMA first and then DMT, and you don't go too high on the dose on DMT, usually what that will actually create is like you will explore these like qualia stream quality of like endless novelty, but it will be within kind of a constrained set of qualia that are all within the range of positive hedonic tone. So, proofs of concept of a qualia stream already exist. And of course, the post-human version is going to be way more exuberant. I think David Pearce actually also has a phrase I really like, which is relative to the consciousness of our post-human descendants, a DMT trip might be as boring as seeing paint dry or something like that, which, if you've ever taken, high dose of DMT, you'll notice is as far removed as possible from paint drying as you can possibly imagine. So yeah, I mean, essentially like extraordinarily entertaining states of consciousness are out there in the state space. And finally, what I call historium, which is essentially, matter and energy and consciousness optimally organized to, essentially have control over the causal structure of the universe. In the ideal scenario, these three things actually work in synergy. Like the reason why there's people kind of in basement reality, out there trying to pursue causal effects is so that they can maintain the qualia stream and the hedonium for everybody else. And essentially, if you're born in this hypothetical utopian society, you're given the free choice. Hey, do you want to just get absorbed into hedonium? No judgment. That's a perfectly fine thing to do. Or also you could do in qualia stream or be an artist for qualia stream. Or you could, essentially contribute the maintenance of these like hyper valuable technologized qualia. So just kind of returning, I think of these very much as kind of like a team consciousness value alignment chart. Is like how do we essentially further the values of consciousness? And I think, it's going to go through like feedback loops, essentially things that actually reinforce themselves. Is why I, even though I do spend a lot of time thinking about how to eliminate suffering, I don't only think about that. I mean, part of it is to avoid burnout and have a high baseline, but it's also because these things are synergistic. And again, my work in the smells and perfumes may seem morally trivial, but actually is a piece of the puzzle. It's part of the whole gestalt. And finally, I think that's about it. So I'll summarize it as, eliminate negative extremes, increase baseline, achieve new heights. The tagline might be something like towards an anodyne, engaging, and ecstatic future of consciousness. So, thank you very much and very happy to answer any questions.
Awesome, Andrés. That's fantastic. What a great presentation. And I'm sure the audience would agree. Do we have any questions ready?
Yeah, also feel free to ask oddball questions. Curveball, I don't care. Happy to answer any question.
Have you thought of designing your own version of DMT?
Oh, right.
What would you, the QRI DMT?
That is a great question. I mean, I think it would be something like... some kind of a hybrid of like MDMA, DMT, and 5-MeO DMT. I don't know. It's so tricky to actually produce a good drug, but
absolutely, Sasha Shulgin probably didn't test it on others for the very reason that sometimes you can get undesirable effects, and you don't want to put people in a bad state.
Yeah, he always tested it on himself first, at extremely tiny doses, and then like increase the dose very gradually. But whenever he actually did detect like real effects, he would actually assemble a gathering of his friends and they would kind of like have a trip together so that they could compare notes. So reports in the book are actually not from him. They're kind of like from his close network of researchers.
Right. Okay, we got a couple of people here. Asu looks as though he's first cab off the rank. Thanks, Adu.
Okay, thank you for the fantastic talk. I've got loads of thoughts, but one thing I've been meaning to ask you in general is how to avoid capture by memeplexes that claim to be like on the side of universal love, and who might be totally capable of giving in the future, say when we have like deepfakes and all of that stuff, giving that sort of like talk, like giving a very, very convincing spiel, like we are on the side of universal love and all that. I'm not sure I have completely understood this problem. I'm sort of like also oscillating, between these strange states where, how do I know that I'm not myself a memeplex trying to take over things and so on. So it's a very difficult epistemological problem. So I was wondering if you have anything to say about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, first of all, I do tend to advocate for explicit value alignment towards team consciousness. I actually, because rightfully, there's so many people who say like they're for peace and love, and in practice they're not, right? Like, or in practice they, McDonald's has advertisements that says, we care about single mothers.
Put a universal love sticker on anything.
Yeah, exactly. So there are several strategies. So, I mean, first of all, the thing I pointed out about does the person actually have skin in the game? Are they like volunteering their time and energies to get rid of intense suffering? I think that's to begin with, that's a good sign. I mean, I trust more people who kind of have that mindset, kind of this altruistic volunteering mindset, and you can prove it. He's like, hey, actually, yes, I've spent 5,000 hours volunteering in this particular way. Obviously, that counts. It's obviously not the whole thing because you can fake
because
it.
That's the strange thing is that even if there is some sort of like negotiation and so on, if actually even adversarial attractors, if they have to prove that they are on the side of universal love by doing something, in the end, the limit is actually that everyone has to actually, because it's the easiest way to prove that you're on the side of universal love and compassion and so on. It might simply that the game theory works out so that actually it's simply easier to be good than. But I don't know if it works that way. But that's a possibility.
Yeah. Exactly. So you're pointing at the second thing I was going to mention, which is absolutely the thermodynamical efficiency of actually being benevolent. You don't need to keep track.
There's this. I don't know where I got this. Being truthful is actually much more easier than keeping up complicated lies and so on. So there are these pressures that actually I think, but this is sneaky because I think this idea also predisposes you to think well about people who are capable of saying, we also understand. So this it's a very weird dynamic. There's something I don't know if I worry about it, but I think about it a lot.
The last thing I'll mention, I mean, and I agree with your concern, but the last one is that, ultimately, the North Star actually would be something like mind melding, because then you can actually verify, the intentions and benevolence of somebody else. That said, I don't think we need to go that far. I mean, even just when it comes to kind of physiological signatures of lying or actually having a different intention can take us pretty far. But I think really where it gets really interesting is when you have the feedback loop happening, right? Because if you do have pockets of society, pockets of civilization with very little intense suffering, a lot of grateful people there, people do have higher baseline and have access to, exotic pro-social states of consciousness, they themselves will be much more productive as a collective. So, or to the extent that is possible, then it's actually, a self-reinforcing loop. And in that sense, the truthfulness is kind of the proof is in the pudding in that.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I don't think of myself as super compassionate person or anything like that. But I think simply like truthfulness and compassion. So it feels much better. It's much easier, and it's simply better than the alternatives. It's not like you're making any sort of like sacrifice or something like that. But this also, I'm slightly, I don't entirely trust my intuitions and feelings here. And I think that's a good thing because, anyone who says that, I have solved the game theoretical problem simply by feeling something, no, then you have to be like really careful.
I mean, like, it's going to be super interesting too as our understanding of the neurological substrate of sub-agents become also possible. That like, because you can hide sub-agents from yourself, right? Like, and that's one of the things that you're pointing out. But I'm pretty sure that if you have like sub-agents that are actually working at cross purposes, that actually has like neurological signatures too, like some kind of internal dissonance, some kind of you actually require to have some kind of accounting process of like, okay, the things that you're saying versus the things you actually mean, which adds kind of like complexity and lowers the valence, and there's all sorts of things that whereas like if you have somebody who just came out of a 6-year loving kindness meditation retreat, you scan their nervous system, is like, no, actually they have very clean sub-agents. I'm pretty sure something you'll be able to see physiologically.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks.
I think PJ had a question.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I was debating whether to actually ask it. One of the things that struck me about hedonium is that it seems very close to a death state, the approaching death state. And that there's an interesting, it's like we'd rather have the simulacrum of death, being transhumanists as we are, supposedly, than death. And that ability to touch it and come back is crucially important. How do you see that relate to possible longevity and other ideas around this space? Yeah,
it's all very synergistic and highly interconnected, in a good way, actually, in this case. So, I mean, first of all, some of these peak states, like really advanced, like jhanas, for example, like very advanced concentration states, essentially they have this incredible synergy between valence, like they feel really good, and they're like extremely healthy and really good for your longevity. Like if, there's this case studies of like, a really hardcore monk, meditator monk in the Buddhist tradition. Sometimes they can access these like jhanas. A different one is also called Nirodha Samapatti. And they can essentially enter into this like extremely calm state of consciousness where they have like close to zero metabolic requirements. Like they breathe very little, they require very, very, very little food, very little water. They can stay there for like days at a time. And from everything that we have gathered, like there's strong suggestions that essentially what they're able to do is experience the lowest energy configuration, essentially kind of like this, in the same way that like a soap bubble, when it's perfectly spherical, it has achieved its lowest energy state. The jhanas are kind of like the lowest energy configuration of your, or Nirodha Samapatti in this case, the lowest configuration state of your nervous system, where essentially there's like very, very, very little grinding of the parts against each other. So like essentially you almost kind of like are halting aging to some extent. Okay, I mean, obviously aging is still going on, but like it's much, much reduced. They also at the same time, give you these very kind of strong apersonal or like transpersonal or I guess open individualist kind of intuition. They're like, hey, like what you truly are is like consciousness rather than this like particular individual. And that says, like aligns you with the interests of consciousness at large, as opposed to just the interest of your ego. Also, to access those states, your ego generally needs to be highly reduced, which also contributes to value alignment towards consciousness. And then, the last thing that you mentioned, like essentially, this kind of a simulacrum of death, that like actually blinking out of existence for a moment actually gives you a lot of appreciation for the opportunity to be alive. So all of this also applies to 5-MeO DMT, which I think, probably, it didn't make it into the cut of kind of drugs that were explored in the 60s, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be a revolution in how people think of consciousness as, more smart, introspective people experiment with 5-MeO DMT. Gives you this, kind of like trifecta of identifying with pure consciousness, extreme well-being, and very good for your own physiology. So it's in that sense, we live in a good timeline. These things are aligned, thankfully.
Thanks so much.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hey, so I was just wondering, and you probably get this a lot, what you would say to people who think that pain is somewhat essential, or it's necessary, or like they sort of say pain is, without pain you have nothing to compare pleasure to. Yeah.
These are definitely classic objections / comments. I think David Pearce makes a really good, he has chapter 4 of the hedonistic imperative. It's kind of like, the 50 most common criticisms or questions. And I think those are some of the ones that he talks about there. But I'll just, mention the core argument real quick, which is, first of all, because empirically, we know that there are people who have close to zero suffering and they are just totally fine. And they can actually, people like Joe Cameron or Roger Teasdale, fourth path Buddhist meditators. So like, it's possible, you don't actually need the suffering to be functional, to process emotions, to process information. It's just not necessary. And the second one is that this idea that you require contrast, for something like pleasure to make sense is also just empirically not the case. I mean, the classic example is, somebody who's experienced depression all their life, and there are people who's, only experience depression all their life. It is not the case that the days where they're like less depressed, they are therefore blissful, or they're therefore like really happy, right? Like, even though they have a contrast between super bad and like just merely bad, it doesn't make the merely bad good in any way, right? Like, so, and then furthermore, if it was an, engineering problem, like imagine it was actually a law of nature, that the thing that you experience as pleasant is the kind of like change or the contrast as opposed to the absolute value, then we can engineer that fairly easily too, right? Like it would be something like you engineer the state of consciousness where you get the feeling that you just got out of hell and you're experiencing that moment after moment after moment. Like you actually were never in hell. That's an illusion, but it's just to induce the contrast. So the claim is that even if it was the case that you required contrast for kind of bliss, by the illusion of contrast, you would get all that you want anyway. So essentially, I think these are concerns that can be overcome.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, Andrés.
Hey, Duncan.
Yeah, great talk. I have a question with respect to how you were describing the like energy and kind of like pleasure trade-off stuff with 5-MeO specifically. I remember that post that you had with the 3 types of euphoria, of like slow, fast, and spiritual. Where would you say that it kind of falls on that shape, or have you kind of updated your model around that since then?
Yeah, totally. So for context, I have this article in Quality Computing called The State Space of Drug Effects. And what I did was conduct factor analysis on, I think it was something like 600 people answering a survey describing drugs in terms of various psychological dimensions. Well, the bottom line is that I found there were like 6 core, principal components or factors that accounted for most of the variance. 3 of which were very relevant to valence. And essentially you had what I labeled as fast euphoria, which is like stimulants, hypermotivation type pleasure. Then you have kind of like relaxed positive valence, like opioids and benzos and alcohol. And then you have what at the time I labeled as a spiritual / philosophical euphoria, which, all of the psychedelics kind of like came in there. The sort of like predictors of that particular factor were things such as like meaningful, colorful, deeply felt, I believe like resonant. There were like various things like that kind of like described that axis pretty strongly. So, at the time it was just kind of like, okay, mapping out these dimensions. Now, looking back, I would say, hey, all of these are actually instances of the consonance, dissonance, and noise parameters of a nervous system. And my current interpretation is as follows. High frequency consonance corresponds or matches to fast euphoria. So actually what goes on in your nervous system when you take a stimulant like amphetamine or something like that, you're actually instantiating this high frequency metronome. It's narrow band, and you can feel it, the vibe of, how it feels in your body and in your mind, kind of like gives you a gridlock to self-organize around. Now, the calm down of a stimulant, this is kind of counterintuitive, right? But like the calm down of a stimulant doesn't mean that you're actually calm or that you're not stimulated. The calm down of a stimulant is discoordinated or uncoordinated stimulation. It's just kind of like the come up of amphetamine is like having a big director kind of conducting an orchestra. The calm down of amphetamine is having all of the instruments still playing, but with no director. So they're going to be kind of grinding on top against each other. So that's why, it actually flips in valence, even though the arousal stays the same after a while. Slow euphoria, the sort of thing that opioids and benzos do, in our current interpretation, is low frequency consonance. Essentially, the low frequency component of the harmonics of your nervous system are in phase, are coherent, and that feels good. But it doesn't have kind of this like high frequency frame that allows you to essentially have a lot of working memory, a lot of slots where to put information. So yeah, it's not very conducive to, computate a lot of, non-trivial computation. Now, where the spiritual / philosophical euphoria comes in here, if I were to write that essay now, I would actually use a different term. I would say criticality or self-organized criticality euphoria, because really what is going on is this kind of fractal consonance. So again, fast euphoria, stimulants would be high frequency consonants, opioids would be low frequency consonants, psychedelics are fractal consonants and dissonance, in that like you can for example, the visual fractals that you get, where like, okay, this like tiny component here is in resonance with this big component here and they move in sync. Yeah, that is essentially cross-scale coupling, where like things that are high frequency, either temporal or spatially, can couple together with things that are low frequency, either temporal or spatially. And so you can form these crazy fractal structures where things are coherent across scales. And that also, has its own valence. 5-MeO-DMT is really special here in that you get essentially a kind of like perfect alignment across all scales. So rather than being kind of like this fractal outgrowth that is colonizing part of your experience, as might be on LSD or DMT, it's like, no. Is the entirety of your experience actually sinking into a fractal attractor. And that would be 5-MeO-DMT.
So on that point, then you would, is it kind of like there's a symmetry axis to this? Because fractals are highly symmetric, right?
Yeah. So there will be up to a point, and then it actually becomes something different. So
more like self-similar.
Yeah, self-similar and continuous as well. That's the other thing. So it's like the question of, for example, like what is more symmetrical, like a Rubik's Cube or, like a dodecahedra or a sphere. That like DMT with kind of its competing clusters of coherence can give rise to experiences that are kind of this hyperdimensional, Rubik's Cube or Megaminx or something like that. 5-MeO-DMT is more like the attractor is a hypersphere, in that like it's not only discrete symmetry, it is continuous symmetry. And so that's actually a higher grade of, it's not just more of the same. You're actually hitting on a higher grade of symmetry. Something's continuously symmetrical, both across scales and across space.
Okay, great. So I guess like a concise way I could ask my question is like, on this new formulation, there's a kind of axis that you were saying 5-MeO is more like, the fractal is like all at one point or like unitary or something. What's the opposite of that on the fractal drug landscape?
I mean, it would. I'm not sure if there is really an opposite to it. I mean, I would say like a bad 5-MeO DMT trip, which is really bad. It's kind of like when you have like two alternative fixed points, two kind of like strong attractors that are both trying to happen, and they're incompatible with each other. And because, you know, they're occupying most of your experience and the dissonance is really, really strong, as opposed to something like regular DMT, which, yeah, you have all these competing clusters of coherence, and usually they're not in tune with each other, so there is some dissonance, but the dissonance is limited. It's not all of your experience in that state of dissonance. So I guess in one formulation, you could say that the opposite of a good 5-MeO DMT trip is actually a bad 5-MeO DMT trip. Definitely opposite in valence. But alternatively, I might say like DPT, because DPT is kind of like a low valence version of DMT. I recently heard described DPT as kind of DMT without the guardrails, or DMT without the loving kindness. So yeah, probably, you know, fractal disharmony of some sort.
Cool. Yeah, that is a super useful answer. I guess the reason why I asked that was because the stimulant, like opiate style, comparison makes a lot of sense for fast and slow euphoria. So like placing, 5-MeO on this new thing was helpful to have something to kind of compare it against. Maybe like dissociate or deliriance as well. Like, I don't know, that could be a whole different can of worms though.
Yeah. Definitely a different kind of worms, but deliriance.
Well, yeah, we can move on. Cool. Thank you for the time. Great talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I have a question. So in your ideal society, what would be, so like this question is about like the last three, the three, I guess, species of consciousness that you imagine would be in a post-human society?
Yeah, hedonium, queliostrium, and historium.
Yeah. So in your ideal society, what would be the ratio of those three?
Oh, sure. Probably something like 45% hedonium, 45% queliostrium, and 10% historium. I don't know, like probably even less historium. I mean, but like the thing is, like, because I anticipate the combinatorial state space to be so large, like I really expect, like, for millions of years, actually, like, historium will continue to produce interesting novelty. So, like, just getting absorbed into the queliostrium is really fun at the time, but you're not contributing to history. So maybe early on, you might want a much larger allocation, and down the line, as, the rate of discoveries actually become smaller, the amount of, like, gems in the state space of consciousness that you're finding becomes, like, more and more sparse, then you start to allocate more resources to, essentially the consciousness you have already optimized.
Okay. I have one more question, if that's all right. So based on, I guess, QRI's ontology, what do you think the ultimate theory of physics will be, like, ultimately? Like, how does that, like, inform, like, your view on that?
Oh, absolutely. So, and here's definitely somewhere where I've been, like, deeply inspired by David. This is, like, an amazing thing that, like, ultimately, I think that theory of consciousness and theory of physics will collapse into the same thing. And, like, even going deeper, theory of math as well, although that's a little bit harder to justify. But yeah, essentially, I think, like, a theory of consciousness, strangely enough, should not only explain, things such as, like, the binding problem and qualia varieties and its causal effects. A good theory of consciousness should actually be able to explain why is there something rather than nothing. And I know that sounds, like, completely crazy and, out of the blue, but I think that's the case. And you can actually investigate these from a first-person point of view, especially in those, like, supersymmetrical states of consciousness, because you realize from first-person experience that essentially no information is in some weird way equivalent to all possibilities in superposition. So really close to kind of like the peak 5-MeO DMT states where like everything is like, let's say, pure space or perfectly homogeneous consciousness. Right next to it, you have something that I call rainbow consciousness. For example, your visual field may actually diffract into what feels like all possible colors. And then you take a slightly higher dose, and then it's like you're looking at that thing from a certain point of view where all of the colors cancel out into just pure nothingness. And you can do this for like many others, qualia, like tactile qualia, like audio qualia. There's a way in which when you have all of the configurations in superposition and you look at it from a certain point of view, it all collapses to some kind of zero. But it's not exactly zero, because it's a kind of like positive zero of consciousness. And a hypothesis would be that, something like the inflationary period of the universe or something like that was actually something like 5-MeO DMT consciousness before it, collapsed into something else. Obviously extremely speculative, but like I ultimately suspect that something like, an information theoretic account of the state space of qualia will contain the key both for valence and our states of consciousness and for the origin of the universe, as weird as that sounds.
Thank you.
Okay, this is very interesting. I was thinking about this while you were talking, Andrés. This idea of the rainbow god, this compulsion to explore all of the state spaces of consciousness, no matter the valence, this simply total curiosity about everything. This, scares me shitless, the idea that this might be, something that is a fundamental part of reality. And you've elsewhere talked a little about the idea that we might cure the rainbow god of its compulsion to suffer, which is something, I think would be a good idea, if for no other reason than that we have so much self-locating uncertainty in our experience. We have this idea that we are talking about in the year 2022 about these things and so on, but that's actually, a information content in our experience and so on. So how to guarantee that we sort of like propagate and are able to take in, stuff that might be on a very different level of sophistication and complexity that might, sort of like try to seduce us into, like, for instance, into the idea that we have to understand suffering in order to, like, prevent it in the future in a way that actually just keeps the cycle going on. Like, do we have something like, I don't know, medical interventions or something like that could help, or simply like giving people access to like true bliss states? Because I think, part of the reason why some people are intrigued by pain or suffering is because it's interesting. It's, much more interesting than the humdrum sort of like drab existence you're living in. So how do we avoid, and this is, I think, something about virtual reality and something, it gives people also a taste of something much better. And if, like, your idea of what might be super interesting is maybe it's painful, as, I don't know, it creates a sort of weird incentive, like gradient space.
Yeah. No, you're pointing to something it's a big topic, obviously, but I'll mention a couple things. So first of all, the rainbow god, okay, like is really kind of an aesthetic. Like I don't believe there is such a thing as like the rainbow god or something like that, but it's an aesthetic, right? But I would say that to a first approximation, kindling the aesthetic of rainbow god in most people is generally beneficial. Why? Because I think to a first approximation, having like a genuine novelty of experience is actually good for your mental health. Like, even if that novelty of experience is not only, you know, positive valence, you know, doing a cold shower or, you know, Wim Hof or something like that. Like, yeah, that's like mixed experiences, but yeah, they tend to be good for the nervous system. So just in terms of kind of like first order effects in society, I think like, okay, there's something good here. Now, if we were to kind of like talk about the archetype of the rainbow god, I did mention at some point, like, it's important to cure it from the compulsion to know every state of consciousness. Because, yeah, I mean, in its pure form, you know, rainbow god would actually be curious about, yeah, what does extreme suffering feel like and things like that. But, you know, in practice, whoever actually embodies rainbow god will either require like superhuman levels of equanimity to actually follow through, or will shake itself apart, right? So it's not really viable to actually be kind of like a pain on out. You know, you're just become depressed, and it's just very difficult. Or unless you're cultivating, you know, high-end equanimity, which is its own thing, which is actually for the purpose of positive valence anyway. So it's not really in the service of pain. But the kind of like aesthetic vision that I have here is more of kind of like thinking of the rainbow god as kind of a toddler. You know, it's like, is an impulse, is that this crazy desire to know consciousness. I think it's good in small doses and tamed. Really what we want is kind of a mature version of it. And like, you know, right now you have, you know, most people were kind of like, most adults are kind of like the mature version of the human toddler. I'm curious about what is the mature version of a rainbow god toddler. Like that is where I think like, okay, this is going to be really interesting. Like, yeah, essentially, yeah, sentient, like sapient super intelligences that like natively they can explore consciousness and they're fascinated by it. I think that, yeah, that's a very, very big chunk of the future.
Yeah, and there's this, you say that it's an important and sort of like a mind expanding thing. In a way, you know, in modal logic, we have this, you know, axiom that if something is possible, if something is actual, then it is possible. So simply by having a certain sort of experience, that actually can tell you a whole lot about reality, simply by the fact that such an experience is possible at all, even though you might not know what else might follow. But that's, you know, but yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, the frame of you know, the experiential states that you get acquainted with, you're actually acquainted with corners of reality. I find that it's quite a good aesthetic. It's not, you're not getting acquainted with an illusion. You're actually getting acquainted with the possible values of the wave function. Just utterly crazy, but yeah, I mean,
even if it's totally illusionary, even if you're hallucinating and it has no truth value or any connection to any very dull stuff, the fact of the experience itself, you know,
yes,
still remains. And
yes, the many textures of the wave function, which, yeah, like, you know, aesthetically, that's okay. When I sample a perfume or something, it's like, yeah, I'm getting acquainted with this texture of the wave function. It's a very different way of thinking about it, obviously. But another thing I'll mention is too, like, you know, when I say something like, hey, like MDMA consciousness, I think it's key for value alignment. A lot of people think of it as like, okay, like, have you ever, you know, seen a bunch of ravers take MDMA and like, you know, like look like they are like able to, you know, hold a job in that state, or like, you know, be responsible and raise kids or something like that. Again, the actual thing I'm pointing at is like, imagine that when you take MDMA, you're experiencing the toddler version of kind of the hyper-empathizing state of consciousness. What I'm interested in is what is the mature, kind of like what is the adult version of the MDMA-like consciousness. I mean, like, how many hours does an MDMA user actually spend in the state to be able to train a mature version of it? And not very much. Like, even if you take MDMA 100 times, you know, that barely amounts to kind of like a week's worth of experience.
Like access. You don't have sustainable access to it and, you know, functional, you know, states. So you can't actually know what would like follow if you could sustainably be in that state. So our ideas about that, well, they are, and there's also the epistemological problem that anyone who's given MDMA the first time or takes well, they are suddenly thrust into this very weird and probably weird phase of experience, and they are not like used to it. They don't have practical knowledge. They don't know how to navigate it and know when to trust certain sort of impulses and when to like pause and take stock and use rationality tools and so on. But if we could have a population or even small groups of people who could be like rational, have meta-rational understanding of when to go with the flow and when you should pause and when to like verify through some external methods and so on. That's what we are missing, and that's not what you get in a rave. That's a very specific like way of being in the state.
I forget. Yeah, absolutely. I forget who said it, but it was maybe Stephen Lehar. But I think Stephen Lehar might have said something like, the typical response of anybody to a drug is interpreted through the naive realist perspective. So, yeah, if you take MDMA, the typical response is something like, oh, I can finally tune in to the love that is around me all the time and I'm just missing out on it. But yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, it's immature because it's actually imagining that, like, you know, those frequencies and vibrations are like literally out there in the world and you're, you know, getting in contact with them. As opposed to, probably what's going on, which is you're getting acquainted with new textures of consciousness inside your nervous system. And for that, you absolutely need some level of meta-rationality. Understand when and when not to take as face value the experiences that you're having. I guess apropos MDMA, like, maybe a year ago tried this, but I actually recommend it. I don't think it's probably good to take it every day, but like, I was really surprised with this supplement, which is a canna. The thing that I find surprising about it is that it's the only, I guess, like non-strong drug, or it's like the only supplement you can actually buy at a drugstore that feels serotonergic. So like, even, you know, you take a couple of these and like, it has the texture of MDMA, even though it doesn't have the full valence of it. And I don't know of any other supplement that does that. So, you know, when it comes to kind of like something potentially sustainable you can use to kind of get some insight into it to make it a mature version.
I think there's something you like stress. We don't need like total like mind-blowing effects. We might need like slight nudges, and that might not subjectively feel like you're being transported into a different reality. It might be that everything simply becomes like slightly easier and slightly more loving. And if that happens like among people and spreads, that it in itself, even if, you know, nobody could point like their finger like this is the exact important change, everything would be like slightly easier, more empathetic, more loving in a way that might be difficult to describe. And that sort of change is probably something we need. Not necessarily we need, of course, like loads of other things and technology and solving the game theoretic problems of math and all that. But I think part of that might be just like slightly nudging everything into a more loving and open direction.
The one metaphor that is quite useful here is like how, well, I guess maybe some of you saw the movie Don't Look Up, which is hilarious movie, but completely unrealistic. That like it's actually not possible to kind of really deal with an asteroid that is like 6 months away. But apparently, it is very easy to deal with an asteroid that is 6 years away. And so, it's actually very simple. All you do is you take a spaceship and you park it right next to the asteroid or right behind it. And just being there, just in the presence of your spaceship, slightly exerts a gravitational pull that, over several years is enough to actually change the trajectory of the asteroid, enough to avoid collision. So it might be something like that, like a fairly small change in habitual state of consciousness at a large enough scale, over the course of 50 years may actually prevent the world, a world war or something like that. Like it's early on as an intervention. Supply, yeah, exactly. Yep.